Hi, Dreki here, and if you've been following my channel for a while, today's video may give you a sense of deja vu, because I've reviewed this camera before. No, it wasn't this exact design or these exact accessories included, but the internal hardware in this camera is nearly identical to one of my previous recommended cameras. To prove it, I went ahead and installed the Suku C30 firmware onto this camera, and as you can see, it's still turned on and recording. Unfortunately, I don't have a C30 to put it side by side with, but once the C30 firmware was installed on this camera, the results are more or less what I expected from the Suku. I will discuss installing the Suku firmware later in this video, including the risks and rewards of doing so, but let's start with the hardware. I'm going to be very brief regarding the hardware of this camera because it's pretty much the standard same old. The camera is plastic and lightweight. It sits a little bit more solid than some of the other cameras I've tested, as the buttons have a bit of a nicer click to them with more feedback, especially that waterproof case. The screen is bright and easy to read in daylight. The copy I got from Amazon included a nice hard case, but this will depend on the seller. Some will include a hard case, some will just include retail packaging. Out of the box, this camera comes with a generic firmware that is branded depending on the seller. Mine is branded ODRVM, but if you purchase it elsewhere, this will be different. Since it's a generic firmware, not much tweaking has been done to the video quality. The result is sort of a Pro Tune-like appearance, I could say. Colors are kind of dull, there's a lack of contrast, and even in bright sunlight everything looks a little bit bland. There's nothing really wrong with this per se, but if you're the kind of person who wants bright, vibrant video without editing, the default firmware does not really deliver that. The gyro stabilization in the default firmware also doesn't work very well, and when the camera is in the waterproof case, audio recording is merely a dull hiss. You'd barely be able to hear voices unless they're yelling. The 4K footage is, as typical with this grade of camera, well, it's not really 4K. It's a weird cropped resolution 2880 by 2160 at 24 frames per second. In almost every situation, you'll be better off using 1080p 60 or 1440p 30, both of which have more detail and a smoother frame rate. Night video is also not that great. There's really no other way of putting it. At night, your best results will be in one of the 30 FPS modes. You'll need to have some source of light. Street lighting is not really enough. Turn off the gyro because it causes some blurring issues. But once that's all done, the video is passable if borderline average. The blurring issue does extend to mixed lighting as well, such as in the forest or indoors. Again, same thing, use a 30 FPS mode and turn off the gyro and the results will be much better. If you don't expect miracles from this camera, the low light video will be passable, but like I said, it's not fantastic. In terms of battery life, this thing does include a spare battery for a reason. I saw about 50 minutes of consistent recording in 1080p 60 with the screen off, and I would say that's pretty ideal. Now, on to the fun part, the C30 firmware. If you're considering installing this firmware, just note that there is no going back. You're doing this at your own risk. I have not been able to locate the original firmware for this camera from any vendor, so if you do this, you are stuck. Installing the firmware is pretty simple though. Just download the correct bin file, version 2.0 for the standard camera or version R if yours has a remote. Put the firmware in the top directory of an empty memory card. Put this card in the camera and then turn the camera on. The camera will flash its lights for a minute or two, then reset itself. Of course, make sure that the battery is full before doing this, and be sure to format the memory card after, or the firmware update will install itself every time you turn on the camera. If you're willing to do this, to me, it is worth it. The C30 firmware includes some small improvement in color. Saturation is increased, meaning everything is more vivid. Green grass is actually bright green in daylight instead of grayish, and the blue skies are brighter. Gyro stabilization is also improved a little bit. This is the kind of video that you would expect if you wanted to do less of your own tweaks. Unfortunately, the C30 firmware does not improve on the audio quality or battery life, and you're still stuck with those low light issues. Like I said though, it does improve things quite a bit, so maybe if you do this, just do it during the return period so you can send the camera back if you mess up. In conclusion, if you can buy the C30, get it over this camera as you'll have better support and updates that are guaranteed to work. But I know lots of you are located in Canada or overseas where the C30 is unreasonably expensive, but this camera is still available for cheap. So it really is a viable alternative since it's more or less the same camera, but that also means it has the same issues. Thank you for watching. If you haven't followed me on Twitter yet, please do so. It's @DrekiMedia.